We are back with no talking, and last chapter, Mrs. Hyatt had all the fifth graders come to an assembly, and she told them to knock it off, and they said, yes, Mrs. Hyatt. So now we're going to find out if, in fact, they are going to stop the contest, or they're going to keep going. Chapter 17 is called Alliances. Do you know what an alliance is? In wartime, or when there are teams battling against each other, often an alliance is when two people or two teams or two groups are working together against the other team. So let's see how this figures into our no-talking contest. As he walked towards his first period class, Dave felt relieved. He was glad Mrs. Hyatt had put an end to the contest. He was especially glad that he wouldn't have to actually mark a big L on Lindsay's forehead. Or the reverse of that. Now he could just think about his schoolwork again, because he really was a pretty good student. That's why he was in the high math group. But as he went into the math room, he didn't talk to his friends, and they didn't talk to him. And none of the girls were talking either. No one was actually sure if the contest was over, and no one was taking chances, including Dave. The bell rang, and as everyone took their seats, it was still completely silent. Mrs. Escobar got right down to business. All right, students, we're still working on metric conversions, and let's see, who's got an answer for the first homework problem? Lindsay raised her hand, and then Mrs. Escobar nodded, and she said 312. Mrs. Escobar frowned. 312 what? Lindsay said degrees Celsius. Mrs. Escobar looked at Lindsay. You heard what the principal said a few minutes ago. Lindsay nodded. About this little game that needs to stop? Lindsay nodded again, then raised her hand. Mrs. Escobar nodded, and Lindsay said, but why? Why? Because it's not good for anyone. It slows down classwork. Like right now, we should be doing math, but instead we're talking about not talking. Lindsay said, math is numbers. Yes, but we need to use words to talk about it, about when we're using numbers. You know all that, so stop this right now. Lindsay stood up and pointed at the dry erase board. May I? Mrs. Escobar said, go ahead. Lindsay had her homework paper in one hand and a marker in the other. She wrote out the numbers for the first problem, then showed the 3 steps she used to get the correct answer. She turned to Mrs. Escobar, and when the teacher nodded, she said, how's that? Mrs. Escobar was starting to boil over. I am not amused by this, Lindsay. I know what you're doing, and I will not stand for it. Now stop it. Lindsay stood at the board. She pointed at the problem. Is this right? Another 3 words. Dave knew that look on the teacher's face. It meant trouble, serious trouble. And not just for Lindsay. He held his breath, waiting for the explosion. The very next moment, Dave amazed himself. He raised his hand. Mrs. Escobar had to grit her teeth, but she managed to say, yes. Dave pointed at the solution on the board and said, mine is different. Without asking permission, Dave was up on his feet. He grabbed the marker from Lindsay and scrawled his work onto the board. He had the same answer, but he had worked with fractions instead of decimals. Mrs. Escobar said, how many of you did it this way, the way Dave did it? About half the hands went up. And the way Lindsay solved it, the other half went up. The teacher nodded. That's good. Does everyone see why it can be done both ways? See how we do problems sometimes different ways in math class? They're doing it that way too. Everyone nodded. Okay, here's a tougher question. Kelly, which way was easier? Dave's way or Lindsay's way? Kelly said, Lindsay's. Really? How come? Fewer steps. And all around the room, Mrs. Escobar saw heads nodding. That special light that shows up on a kid's face when understanding happens. She smiled. That's right. Decimals really do make things easier. Tyler raised his hand and said, with a calculator, which got a laugh from our whole class. And as they laughed, Dave and Lindsay looked at each other for about half a second. Not quite a friendly look, but similar. Then Dave thought, this means the contest is still on. And he wasn't sure how he felt about that. The class sailed through the rest of the conversion problems, miles to kilometers, kilometers to ounces, and on and on. And every student responded using 3 words or less, or with written answers on the board. Mrs. Escobar knew the kids weren't obeying Mrs. Hyatt. She knew they were still counting words, still keeping silent unless called on. But honestly, at this moment, she didn't care. She was in the middle of an amazingly productive class period, and everyone was so focused, so alert, so engaged. Compared to the classroom experience she'd had with these same kids just 24 hours earlier, well, it was like night and day, and she liked day much better. So I have to stop there because this chapter is really long, and I'm actually going to split it into 3 parts. So that's how math class went. How do you think some of the other classes are going to go? We'll find out next time.